The Door, an Undertale fanfiction by Topaz Shadowwolf. Undertale and the characters in the story are owned by Toby Fox. The setting is post-neutral run when Papyrus dies, with chapter intros being before the child falls. The relationships that appear in this story mostly focus around Sans and Toriel, also known as Soriel. The rating for the story is teen, for swearing, mention of character death, violence, Flowey being Flowey, and some heavy themes. The Door, Chapter 1. And so the story begins. She didn't often check the door that leads out of the ruins. In fact, she often ignored it. Walking down those stairs, through the hallway, and standing before that gateway was always filled with painful memories. Kara, Azriel, Shaniqua, Walter, Adam, Isabel, Marcella, Ruth. So much death surrounded her that it was unbearable. That door. That damned door. Toriel stood before it, teeth clenched and hands dancing with flames as she wanted so much to destroy it. Futile tears streamed down her face, as much as she wanted nothing more to do with the rest of the underground and him. She could not bring herself to be completely cut off. Shivering with built-up emotion, she relaxes her magic before hugging herself and silently weeping at her own cowardice. She is a stupid, arrogant, foolish, irrational, silly old woman. Curling up by the door, she lay there, counting in her head every time she did something that proved that she never should have been a mother. Once through with that list, she remembered all the reasons why she was a terrible wife, and why she never should have been queen. Midway through that list, she heard a voice. It was soft and somewhat distant. The sound of crunching snow hinted the owner of the voice was getting closer. She sat up listening, angry that her self-hatred was being interrupted, and yet thankful for it at the same time. Curiosity kept her silent, as she wanted to know what the monster was doing by the door. There was a chuckle, then 2 knocks on one of the stone doors. "Knock, knock," the voice said, and she considered telling the monster to go away. And yet, his deep voice filled the loneliness in her soul. Before she could do anything, the voice continued. "Who's there?" She was surprised and covered her mouth. Did he somehow know she was behind this door? "Catch up," the voice continued, and then paused. "Catch up with me later, and I'll tell you." She put the palm of her lip, and she understood now what the monster was doing. He had no idea she was there, his only audience to his comedy show of knock-knock jokes. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Knock, knock. "Who's there?" "Police." "Police who?" "Police, hurry up, it's cold out here." It had been a long time since Toriel had heard such jokes, and she struggled not to laugh. Oh, how she wanted to laugh. She really did, but she feared she may scare this potentially shy comedian away. And yet she couldn't help but notice he wasn't laughing either, just chuckling now and then at his own jokes, but never really laughing. Someone needed to laugh. These jokes were good, and for them to be told and not laughed at felt wrong. "Knock, knock," the deep voice said. He had stopped actually knocking on the door by then, most likely to spare his knuckles. "Who is there?" It took every ounce of courage for her to utter those words. Her voice almost sounded hoarse from lack of use. There was a sound of crunching snow. He wasn't moving away. Churning, perhaps? She must have startled him. "Dishes?" The way he said it sounded almost like a question, as if he was unsure if he had really heard a voice just now. "Dishes who?" There was another pause, shorter than the first, before he responded. Dish is a really bad joke." That was a really bad joke. It was horrible. It was hilarious. Toriel burst into laughter, new tears squeezing out through shut eyes. They were different than the tears from earlier. They were happy. She laughed for that joke and all the jokes before, and to her surprise, the monster on the other side was laughing too. "Sorry if I startled you," she said sheepishly. "Knock, knock," came the reply, not skipping a beat. "Who's there?" It felt childish, but she was eager to hear what this one would be. Apollo. Apollo who? Apology accepted. The only sound to be heard was the echoing scuffle of his slippers as he ambled into the corridor. Just minutes before now, he had spoken to the kid, fighting back every dark desire in his body to tear them apart. That yearning had only been made worse as they declared to him proudly that this was their final run. As if that, or what they had done, was anything to be proud of. He had felt time jump then, an odd hitch in reality. There was only a laugh when they spoke. Perhaps he had attacked them, and they reloaded the world back to this point. If so, was it just once? Did they kill him, or did he kill them? Not that it matters. In the end, they always get their way. So was that it? Did he just give up yet again? Yeah, that's what he was best at, giving up. In psychology, there's this thing called learned helplessness. He figured that has something to do with it. Really, he's using it just as a sorry excuse for being lazy. But hey, how many times can a person really try to do something and fail before they just give up trying? How many times can you watch everything you build be torn back down to the start before you say screw it? But giving up is different than not caring. Some people accuse him of not caring, even himself. The truth is he did care. Otherwise, he wouldn't even act in that timeline, when all things end. Acting before then just lets the kid learn and adjust to his fighting style and moves. That was the mistake he made with the first anomaly. And maybe he just knew better than to fight the inevitable. After all, this was how the kid was going to end things. With him alone, struggling on without his brother. No matter what he did, the kid will make sure they got the ending they wanted. He reached back, grabbing the hood of his jacket and pulling it over his skull before shoving the hand back into its pocket. With a resigned sigh, he leaned back against the stone wall and slid down it until he was sitting. Tucked into the left inside pocket was his brother's scarf, neatly folded in respect. It was safe, close to his soul. Feeling it there was reassuring and agonizing all at the same time. He drew his knees up, trying to make himself as small as possible. At this moment, he wanted nothing more than to withdraw from this world and give up. And why shouldn't he? Papyrus, his dear brother, was no longer here. Without that joyful personality around, it would just be so easy fading from life. What more was there for him to live for? His brother was the most important person in his life. Sure, there were others he knew. Some he called friends. But he didn't feel anything for most of them beyond being just people he knew about. Well, that wasn't completely true. There was that lady behind the ruined door. She was a good friend. Her laugh had brought a ray of joy into his otherwise dismal life. Why else would he start trying to bake like she does? But the last time he knocked on the door, after the kid passed through, there was silence. Had the kid killed her too? No, he won't give up just yet. He will struggle on until he made a phone call to the kid, pouring out all his malice into words to them one last time. After that, if he dusted, he would be fine with it. For now he will watch and see who filled the power vacuum that had been made when Asgore died. Undyne, perhaps? She was still alive and was most likely to try taking the position. He had to admit, she was mostly Papyrus's friend and more his boss. Not that he didn't like her. He actually admired her a bit. The problem between them was their personalities didn't mix well at times. Without his brother around, there was no one to convince her of whatever usefulness his brother saw in him. She was sure to sack him, meaning he would need to find a new job. Well, he didn't really have to. There was enough in savings to last him to the phone call. The consideration of how long before he could just fade into dust was interrupted as he heard footsteps coming down the hall. He sighed and started to stand, gearing himself up to greet whomever it was that was coming. His legs refused to work as if they had given up hope before the rest of the body. Annoyed, he continued sitting and just looked up, laughing bitterly inside, as looking up at others was nothing new. He just never figured he would have to look up from such a low perspective before. And the sickeningly funny thing about it is how it mirrored how he felt inside. Normally, he wasn't bothered by how short he was, though at times he really hated it. If only the world was designed more for the vertically challenged. With effort, he forced himself to get white eye lights to shine in his sockets. His vision was blurred, unfocused at first, but as it cleared, he saw that it wasn't Undine running to the end of the hall. He was actually a little surprised to see it was a goat monster, much like Asgore. She had started to pass him, clearly not noticing the little sorry excuse for a lump he had curled himself into. Not that he blamed her. He didn't bother turning his head and just stared straight ahead, letting out a sigh before saying in a dark tone, "Asgore isn't here anymore, if that's why you've come." "Actually, I'm here for the child. Are they all right?" Her voice. He heard it before. That was a surprise. Furthermore, he couldn't think of whose face the voice belonged to. He looked at her again. There couldn't be many goat monsters in the underground. Through a sentry station and hot dog stand, he had kept himself informed on the things going on in the underground, and all the monsters. How many goat monsters did he know about? Inhaling sharply through his teeth, he cursed himself out in his head for not figuring it out sooner. With the realization that he was speaking to the queen, well, former queen, he forced himself out of the deep depression he had been slipping into. With years of practice behind him, he kept the shocked feeling from his appearance. Instead, he wore his usual smile, the smile of false happiness. And yet there was a part of him that felt that was unnecessary, that there was no reason to hide his true self from her. Strength returned to his legs, and he stood, shoving the hood off his head. He tried to muster up some amount of respect to her. Should he bow? It seemed like the right thing to do, though he never bowed for Asgore. He'll skip the bow. It's not his style anyway. "Sorry, I didn't, Anyway, the kid was gone. Killed King Asgore, and left. The 6 souls are gone, too. And that's the situation, Your Highness." The title came out sounding more like a question than an acknowledgement of her authority. Formalities is not his thing, so much so, he wasn't sure why he was trying to behave like he knew how to be formal. He never did for Asgore, called him King Fluffy Buns to his face even. Maybe it's because his mind is still trying to convince him he somehow knows her as more than the former queen. "Please don't. I gave up that title a long time ago," she sighed, and put a paw to the right side of her face. Frustrated and feeling like an idiot, he looked down as a part of him wished this encounter would just end. The soft sound of sniffling, as if she was crying, caused him to glance up to see tears in her eyes. Her voice trembled as she said, "I should have been here for them." "I doubt that would have made much difference," he said, turning his head slightly to look away before he closed his eye sockets and turned back to look at her again. He was about to say more, but was held back by a puzzled look in her face. "I know you," she said slowly, taking a deep breath to remove the sadness in her voice. She then started to move both hands to her mouth, trying to hold back a huge smile with no avail. "I do know your voice. You're the person who told me all those wonderful jokes through the door." He felt his eye sockets darken again, as that information sunk in. This was his knock-knock joke friend? All this time he'd been telling those cringe-worthy puns and embarrassingly life stories to her, the queen of the underground. The queen of all monsters was listening to him, laughing at his jokes. Of all the monsters that existed in the underground, he had been enjoying the laugh of Asgore's ex-wife. And this was also the person he made that promise to. Looking at her, he could only see kindness, tenderness. How? How could he ever tell her that his younger brother, a monster he promised to introduce her to if they ever met, was dead, killed by the human child he promised her to protect? He felt a cold chill go through him as he lit his eyes again. She extended a large paw to him. "My name is Toriel. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "The name's Sans, and, same." He put his hand in hers, and they shook. There was a warmth creeping into his face, around his cheekbones, and it felt like something was moving around in his ribcage. His soul, perhaps? Toriel hung on to his hand a bit longer than he expected, which seemed to cause the warmth to spread. She was looking down at it next to hers, and the size difference was unignorable. Compared to hers, his hand looked like it belonged to a child and not a monster of his age. Sans was beginning to wish he had worn his mittens here. With the extra padding, they tended to make his bony fingers seem just a bit larger than they actually are. "I'm really sorry, She started, looking up at him sheepishly, goatishly, as she finally released his hand, though he'd admit he was slow to take it back. "I'm sorry, that was so rude of me. Well, you're different than I expected."
Sans shrugged. "I get that a lot, so forget about it, okay?"
Was he feeling embarrassed? He wasn't sure anymore. He could still feel the heat in his face, and his soul seemed to be bouncing around even more. He hadn't felt embarrassed since he was smaller, a baby bones. It's easy to not feel embarrassed when you just stop caring about what others think. He rubbed the back of his skull, looking down as he shuffled one foot, seeing his clothes in the process, witnessing what a mess he was for the first time in what felt like ages. That confirmed it. This was embarrassment. For some reason, he cared about what he looked like around her. Maybe because they had talked about this meeting for so long, and now here he stood in all his lackluster glory. In all honesty, at this point, he'd be surprised if she still wanted to spend time with him.
"I, wasn't expecting to learn the Queen was behind the door."
"Please, Sans, it's former Queen, and I'd rather you call me Toriel," she smiled softly. "Or, actually, Tori."
Did his soul just bounce into his non-existent throat? That was the only explanation he had for the sudden lump that he was struggling to speak around. He swallowed, trying to regain control. Tori. That felt weird, yet satisfying at the same time. With Asgore gone... He winced slightly. Toriel had been married to the king at one point. He could show more sympathy for her loss. Now that he passed, Monsterkind will be looking for a new leader. And if you want, you could unformer yourself and just be the queen again. I think Monsterkind would adore having you back. He winked after saying the pun. She laughed, and he failed to notice his usual false smile crack into a stupid grin. That sound, that beautiful sound. It was even better without a door between them. As a comedian who occasionally puts on a show at MTT, he has heard many laughs, but none have gotten to him like hers. And now he could see her. He could see she was as wonderful as her laugh. Once she regained her composure, she nodded. "You're right. Perhaps I should." Toriel looked towards the pathway that led out towards the throne room. "Sans, it is lonely being a ruler. At times I wondered how Asgore was without his family." The fool, if only... She sighed and looked back at the small skeleton. He felt a longing to hug her when he saw the sadness in her eyes. They had been friends through the door for a long time. Yet, now that they had finally met, it seemed different. Would hugging her be appropriate? She didn't really know him. He was just a stranger knocking on a door telling her jokes. "I hope this isn't too forward, but I wanted to ask if you would like to live around here, or even in the castle. There are several rooms for those who are meant to work and live here. It would be good to have someone around I know I can trust and enjoy laughs with." Toriel tilted her head slightly as she spoke. He felt his eyelids shrink as that surprised him. He wanted to speak, but all that came out was a staggered sound, as it seemed his soul had now thoroughly wedged its way into his voice. I know you have your younger brother to take care of. He is welcome to move in as well, of course," Toriel kindly added, then said in a sadder tone, "And you don't have to be here every day. I'm sure you have more important things to do than hang around with an old woman like myself." If it were physically possible, Sans would have ripped out his soul right then and there and thrown it on the floor before cursing it out. Her sadness and remembering his brother caused his soul to drop into the pit of despair it had found when his brother died. Only now it seemed to have gone deeper than normal, into a dark place within him. Papyrus. His eye socket started to burn, and it was a struggle to keep his eyes lit. With all that had been going on, he hasn't really had time to properly mourn the loss of his brother. That fact seemed to hurt more than Pap not being here. After all, Papyrus was everything to him that mattered. And he hadn't done more than weep as he first folded up the scarf. Everything about this exchange with Toriel was weird to him. For some reason he felt so open with her. He, at some point, shed his normal smile, the mask-like expression he always wore. Was it because he considered her a good friend? Or maybe he was like this because he had grown used to never having to hide himself from her voice. After all, before now, they couldn't actually see each other. There still seemed to be a lump for him to speak around. So he started to clear his figurative throat. He couldn't tell her, not the truth, that the kid he watched, that he promised to protect, killed his harmless brother. He inwardly hoped with all of his might that his eyelids were lit as he spoke. "No, I'd, love to move here and help out. Pap will most likely stay in Snowden. We had a fight. I'm sure he'd like me out of the house for a while." He would like out of the house for a while, not to have to return to that empty space. He had no time to react. No, that's not right. He had time to react. He always had time to react, it seemed. Instead, the truth was he froze up as she quickly stepped forward while going into a kneeling position, her arms wrapped around him, holding him tightly. "I'm sorry to hear that." He noticed how stiff he was as his body started to collapse in her embrace. Something warm was moving down his cheekbones. Great. Just great. He was crying, and becoming more of a mess than he already was. His arms trembled as he wrapped them around her, seeking her support so he could regain control of himself. "It's okay. You know, he's my bro, so fights happen. We'll, get over it." He backed away, quickly using his sleeve to remove the tears while looking at the floor for something else to think about. It was truly a nice floor. The monster who had installed it had done a wonderful job doing so. This made him wonder how badly it had been torn up the times he had fought the child. Shaking that thought from his head, he shoved his hands back in his jacket pockets. "So, anyway, I'll stick around as long as you can sans me." He heard her giggle at his weak attempt at a pun of his name. Ah, that sound. He couldn't help but genuinely smile at that sound. "Are you kidding me? I'd get awfully bonely without you around," she said, causing him to chuckle. "Well, can't say I'll be much help. I'm known for being a lazy bones and skulking around." How did he get her to giggle with such terrible puns, he wondered. "Ha! Well, if I need you, I'll just give you a poke in the ribs. See if that doesn't help you get your backbone into it." She smiled kindly down at him. Why did his face feel so warm? He thought this joking had gotten him past the initial embarrassment, and yet something was still going on inside him. He just can't get his eyelids off her. He adored her laugh when he first heard it. Then he found he couldn't help but long for when he'd hear her voice again. Was he... She broke that train of thought. "But it's all right. I really am just asking you to stay for company and advice. I had been alone in the ruins for so long." This time he was the one who hugged first, wrapping his arms around her in his usual slow pace. "Well, you won't be alone now. I'm here to help, and I can get a skeleton done when I try." She laughed and hugged him back. "Believe me when I say I'm not bad at paperwork. In fact, no one has ever told me I'm terrible at it. Of course, they could be folding back. Anyway, I'll make sure that sheet doesn't slow you down, if you want." She laughed, and he joined in. After they slowed to a soft chuckle, he started to release his hug, but she tightened her grip. This surprised him. He was not expecting her to choose to cling to him like this. Only Papyrus had ever done that. The sharp pang of sadness returned, and he buried his face into her neck, and he held on to her as well.